Welcome to the AERA Writing and Literacies SIG podcast. My name is Alex Corbett.
And my name is Karis Jones.
And today we have the unique honor to speak with Tananarive Due and Dr. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas. Their writing and scholarship spans a variety of genres, disciplines, and forms. The theme of this podcast is for guests to share their work, mentor other writers and scholars, and to cite folks who inspire their work. Before we begin with the questions, we'll start with some formal introductions.
I'm a lecturer at UCLA in the African American Studies Department, where I teach a class on Black horror right now called The Sunken Place, Racism, Survival, and the Black Horror Aesthetic. And in the spring, I'll be teaching my Afrofuturism course, which is more inclusive, not just of horror, but obviously science fiction, futurism, magical realism, fantasy, all of that. Combined, and I've been teaching at UCLA for about 4 years. They invited me to come in, and I've been thrilled to do it. And my latest publication, one of my few, because I'm a fiction writer. Before I began teaching, I was a writer. So I don't do a lot of academic writing, but my last academic essay was in the annotated screenplay for Jordan Peele's Get Out, because he asked me to write the introduction. So that's an introduction called Get Out and the Black Horror Aesthetic. And yeah, that's me.
Oh boy, I'm just fangirling here, and I'm trying not to fangirl, I'm trying to, but I am such a fan of Professor Due's. One of my first, I think maybe the very first Black horror book that I ever read was hers. I was an undergraduate at FAMU, and I want to, was it The Living Blood? Was it, I'm trying to remember. It was your book that came out, was it in 96 or 97?
Then it was My Soul to Keep.
My Soul to Keep, yes, My Soul to Keep. And I remember buying it from Amin-Ra bookstore and like, oh my gosh, because before you, the only horror I had ever read was Stephen King, right? Because that's what I grew up. So just thank you. And okay, now that I'm over my fangirl gush, I should talk about who I am. Well, I came to this work because I was a fangirl. So I started off in Harry Potter fandom. My name is Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, and I'm associate professor of reading, writing, and literacy in the Department of Literacy and International Education at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. I've been a professor for about 10 years. Before that, I was a K-12 teacher in Detroit, Michigan, and I was also a huge fangirl. So I've been a member of over a dozen fandoms over the past 25 years. And so I came to this work of studying, the experiences of fans from the margins. So first Black fans, but then I expanded my considerations to think about fans of color, and now I'm thinking about all fans of speculative fiction genres from the margins. And when I say fans, I'm thinking about readers, viewers, and audiences. So that's me.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much. Well, and that's a great transition to our first question, which is about sharing more about your work and putting it in conversation with each other. So our question is, how does your work rethink or resist the conventions of speculative fiction? And then I have kind of like a follow-up question. What conventions of speculative fiction need to be reworked? And how are you as scholars challenging these conventions in similar or different ways?
That's an interesting question. And, listening to Dr. Elizabeth speak reminds me of when I did start way back in the when. 1997 was my second publication. My first novel, The Between, was published in 1995. And back then, I did not know any other Black horror writers. There have been some, but I did not know. I had never read horror by a Black author myself. I hadn't even read Octavia Butler yet. So Octavia Butler had been publishing for years, but I did not discover Octavia Butler until after I was already writing My Soul to Keep. and someone said to me, "Oh, have you read Octavia Butler's novel about the immortal African?" Because my novel is about an immortal African. And I was like, you know, so this is all to say that there was quite a bit of loneliness for me at the outset. I did not understand that it was even okay for me to write genre. I had gotten not so subtle messages while I was an undergraduate at Northwestern. I graduated from Northwestern University with a degree in journalism, but a minor as a creative writing. I did all the requirements that a creative writing major would have done. And during that time, reading the classics, reading the canon, you get both the sort of erasure of yourself as a Black person in literature, in the canon, so-called, and also the not so subtle genre bias, both of them in tandem. So it was not okay for me in any way, shape, or form to be a Black genre writer. In my head, I started writing epiphany stories, housewives. In fact, by the time I was an undergraduate, and certainly by the time I was in graduate school at the University of Leeds, where I got a degree in English, a master's in English, I was writing white characters. And I wasn't even really writing genre. So there was none of me reflected in my work. Like I was 200 pages in to a novel from a white male perspective that had nothing to do with genre before I ran out of material because I was not writing about myself. I had never been in New York. I had never had a brother. I mean, I was reaching for things that were not organic to my own thinking, my own experiences. And it really did take some time to give myself permission, to be a Black writer who, not having had a rural experience, for example, like all my heroes and my heroines were Alice Walker and Toni Morrison, right? And it wasn't until Gloria Naylor wrote Mama Day and had the metaphysical aspect to it that I realized, oh, you could be a Black woman who writes the metaphysical, and that's okay, right? And then so-called, and then an interview with Anne Rice on another level helped me learn that you could be respected while writing speculative fiction, which again was something very important to me. I should point out, Dr. Elizabeth mentioned she graduated from FAMU. My parents were civil rights activists who met at FAMU. My late mother, Patricia Stephens Due, my father, attorney John Due, and that was quite a legacy I felt that I had to live up to. So when I say I wasn't allowed to, I mean, I did not have internal permission to do anything foolish. And if I perceived that there was no respect for horror, no respect for genre, then it's no wonder it took me a while to make my way back around to it. And having come up through that canon of the classics and the Canterbury Tales and all the way through, you know, the Faulkner and of course I had to look for myself even as a Black person and how a Black person fits in. So in terms of challenging conventions, it's always been from the standpoint of representation, just finding myself, creating characters who looked like me, who acted like me, just middle-class suburban characters. That was my first novel, in the suburbs, because that was where I had grown up. I had never seen that in literature. I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing to me, but I really had never seen that in literature. So I had to really go out on a limb to declare me as a writer. And me was someone who had grown up, you know, sort of between worlds and the suburbs and dealing with this sort of liberal racism as opposed to old school Jim Crow racism, you know, back in the day. And that was a tough path. It was a tough realization for me to make that I could actually exist in my own work.
Wow. And I just remember when we found your work, my friends and I, you know, I hung out with a bookish crowd. I mean, your work was like a shooting star for us. Because there was we had your series, we had Octavia Butler, and I'm trying to think of who appeared or who emerged in adult speculative fiction with Black women protagonists before 2000. And there just wasn't a ton. And so I did read once I was, I think The Living Blood came out when I was maybe a new teacher, right? So it was, But I just remember reading your books, Octavia Butler's books. Then there was The Dark Matter anthology and its sequel by Sheree Renee Thomas.
Yes, Sheree
Not
Renee
pronounced-
Thomas
Sheree,
edited
yep,
that.
Sheree, yes.
Groundbreaking, Dark Matter.
Yes. So, I mean, I just remember looking for what you had and looking for myself or trying to find traces of myself in the genres which I preferred, because growing up in inner city Detroit, I was always looking for an escape. And unfortunately, so many of the escapes that were offered to us did not feature any kinds of characters that looked like us. So whenever you were to read Black fiction, by the time I was a little girl in the 80s, it was as if, beyond Virginia Hamilton's work, you were supposed to be learning something, you know. So what would happen is you would read the classics, so Alice in Wonderland, The Wizard of Oz, etc. And then you would say, you know, you go to your teacher or librarian and you would say, well, I'd like to read a story with a little Black girl in it. And then you would get a story about Harriet Tubman. Or, you know, you would get a story about, and I love her. I mean, I cried oceans when I read the final book in the Logan family saga. So I loved Cassie Logan from Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. So I read that whole series avidly and felt a very personal connection to it. But that literature isn't exactly escapist. So it's the kind of story that I would read, you know, in order to be enlightened, to learn, and to admire the characters in it. So I was like, wow, my ancestors and my elders were some strong people. And again, like Professor Due said, you know, I don't need to be playing around here. But, you know, unfortunately, when I was coming up, if you wanted to dream or imagine, you know, you really had to turn. Once I was done with reading the little bit we had out there, I was, you know, reading Anne of Green Gables. I was reading the Chronicles of Narnia. And I'm not saying that those stories are terrible, and, you know, because millions of kids have read those growing up, but they just aren't very inclusive of children who aren't white, upper middle class, cisgender, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the things I've been so passionate about over the course of my time as a fan, as a K-12 teacher, and now, you know, finishing my first decade as a professor, is thinking about race and representation in the media that we give to children and teens and young adults, because so much of that does shape consciousness. It shapes our, you know, collective imagination. It shapes our sense of not only who we are ourselves, but it also teaches us how to treat each other.
May I jump in again? Also, I want to apologize. I've been calling you Dr. Elizabeth instead of that.
That's fine. I answer to that too. That's my whole, I have a double name. So Ebony Elizabeth, that's my, yes, my grandmother's name was Elizabeth, and that was going to be my name, but it was a 70s. So my mom just said Ebony on top.
Okay, got it. I totally understand.
Yes.
But you brought back the memories when you mentioned Dark Matter, that first anthology of Black speculative fiction edited by Sheree Renee Thomas. It included Octavia Butler. I was in there. My husband, Stephen Barnes, was in there. And that came soon after I met Steve and Octavia at a conference in 1997, which I think did signal the beginning of this blooming of representation among Black writers, at least, in speculative fiction. It was at Clark Atlanta University, and it was the African-American fantastic imagination explorations in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And on the basis of my first novel, The Between, I was invited. I had never been in a room of readers and scholars who appreciated and read speculative fiction. I mean, even after I published, it was sort of, I was at the horror events where it was mostly white, and at the Black bookstores where they really had to sometimes talk to people and say, no, this is not gonna curse you if you read that, if you read this book.
That was,
you know, so I was overcoming barriers wherever I went. And this was Clark Atlanta was the first time I was with what I would consider family. We took a photograph that day, and it was hugely inspirational to realize that I was not alone.
oh, wow. And by the way, your husband's duology, the Lion's Blood duology, that was the first time I had read any alternate history by and featuring Black folks. I was
amazing. It's so good too, yes.
Oh man, I tell you. So I'm just so passionate about it. And I'm so thrilled to see the burgeoning over the past 20 or 25 years. There's so much more out there now for those coming after us. So, you didn't have, you were trailblazing in ways that, so many of us who came after appreciated. Now there's a generation coming up who have all these books.
Oh,
And
they're
all,
spoiled. They're
I
spoiled
mean,
now.
yes, I know. They just don't know.
Black
They
Panther.
don't know that they have it.
We could fight okay. It's like, do you understand how groundbreaking that movie is and how hard it
Right.
was and how much cultural capital had to be expelled to get to that point? But it's true. When I started teaching Afrofuturism at UCLA, I could only point to a short film by Wanuri Kupumzi, the Kenyan filmmaker, because there just wasn't a lot of so-called Afrofuturism on film. I could find it in literature. There was Octavia, there was Steve, there was me, there were Nala Hopkinson, all these writers. But when it came to film, very little. And that is a big change just in 4 years. Now there's almost too much. Now I feel like I have to bifurcate the class into like specific topics or specific themes because there's so much Afrofuturism now.
Yeah, I have a question for you about that. One of the things that, wait, can I ask questions? Okay. So Professor Due, because I've been talking with other theorists and scholars and some young authors about this. Do you think now we have enough in the category to begin thinking about subgenres, or are people already thinking about some subcategories there? I'd love to hear more about that from you.
Well, there are, and my definition of Afrofuturism is somewhat broad. When I say Afrofuturism, I really mean the Black speculative arts, meaning music, graphic novels, films, literature of the African diaspora, right? Now, there are some people who look at Afrofuturism as more American and more dealing specifically with futurity, specifically science fiction. So I would say that despite all of it, and the Black speculative arts movement has emerged as another name for it, because some people feel like Afrofuturism is a little bit of a Columbus syndrome because it was named by a cultural critic rather than named from within, Mark Derry, right? So there are many definitions here at play. But to answer your question specifically, yes, I think clearly because there is so much, no matter what any individual's idea of what Afrofuturism is, like for instance, Nnedi Okorafor, the Nigerian American writer, has been really publicizing the term African futurism, which is fair, right? And Pumzi, the film that I teach and still do teach when I teach Afrofuturism, is absolutely African futurism. It's an African creator. It's an African story. And the African continent itself is so vast that I'm sure you could have subgenres just within that. If you really, once more and more African artists feel permission, as I did, to write speculative fiction, of course, so it'll be the Caribbean, it'll be Africa, but to me, maybe it's because my first name, Tananarive, it used to be the capital city of Madagascar, and I have sort of felt that connection to Africa my whole life. When I think of Black and Afrofuturism, to me, it is, it's the diaspora.
Yes. No, I truly agree with you that, thinking of it expansively makes more sense than sort of, narrowing it. Although I have read that essay that she placed on her blog, Nnedi Okorafor placed on her blog, and I can completely understand. But, I also think that there's so much in Afrofuturist work that does speak to the diasporic experience, which is also super valid, so it is, they're different experiences. I want it all. So I want both and all more. All these
Americans, the descendants of slaves, people who were never enslaved, but who lived under colonization. There's so many similar trails that these stories take, even though we had different experiences.
Yeah.